Edel Garcellano's metacriticism on cinema is based on the notion that dialectical materialism is a praxiological, contra-theoretical only framework that can help rehabilitate film criticism from its bourgeois infantilism. The difference between a theoretical and praxiological framework is how one accesses and treats knowledge. A theoretical framework only aspires to generate knowledge and not to create a guide for action. Remember that dialectical materialism would not be complete without the intent of changing the social practice itself. Hence, the conclusion would yield to a plan of action, a guide to action, based on the theoretical understanding that would be developed in the study. Garcellano's dialectical materialism has not been explicitly defined in any text he has written. It is implied. In his metacriticisms of several works of critics, he paints a picture of dialectical materialism in opposition to the practice of aesthetic criticism in itself. It is very apparent in his essay titled A Choice of Film Review, or Reviewing the Reviewers, where he shares an important note about the production of art and the praxis of film criticism. Artistic unity must correlate with historical logic and dialectics. For Garcellano, aesthetic criticism may have shown the inner workings of the work of art or film. However, it is an incomplete assessment. For him, there is a need for a comprehensive analysis of such, one that involves a critique of the historical and material conditions that surround the production of work of art or film. It runs parallel with Lenin's notion of unifying both analysis and synthesis in order to break down parts and syntactically rebuild these parts through a process of syntactic thinking. In my essay titled Transforming Film Criticism into a Militant Practice, I have highlighted the importance of establishing a dialectical materialist framework in transforming the bourgeois practice of film criticism into a militant one. The necessity of such a transformation is drawn from the predominant practice of local film criticism as individualist ordeal that focuses the expropriation of opinions in the free market of ideas or the communicative neural network. This resonates with Garcellano's critique of formalist criticism as a form of liberal critique trumping over class-based differences, failing to confront the semi-capitalist, semi-feudal structure that allows such gross, inhuman hierarchical distinctions. The necessity of re-injecting a historical and dialectical materialist, class-based praxis in film criticism is central to Garcellano's mode of critique as praxis, which he has detailed in his essay The Filipino as Critic in a Time of War. In the essay, Garcellano has explicitly valued the act of reading a text as equivalent to reading the historical materialist inscription of reality that stares him/her in the face. This is in congruence with 5 conditionalities. A. That the Philippine society is under siege and is a text being rewritten by imperialist forces. B. That the critic is complicit with dominant ideological constructs. C. The critic has blind spots when he or she views the world. D. The aperture of the critic's text is the closure of the critic's consciousness, which does not transcend history and society. E. That the critic's canonical truths are not necessarily true. Indeed, the place of the critic is not in his or her own safe space, but rather in the ongoing class war where contending class interests are waged. Throughout his writings, Garcellano's mode of practice of dialectical materialist critique has 2 modalities. One mode is drawn towards his critique of metaphysics, and the other mode is the critique of the author function. In this section, both modalities will be explored to craft a general picture of Garcellano's own method of criticism. In his essay, A Choice of Film Review, or Reviewing the Reviewers, there is an outright and explicit acknowledgement of dialectical analysis over aesthetic criticism. He favors the macro approach to film criticism, which views film as an extension of the contemporary socio-political ferment of society, the historical reenactment of a particular event in all the possible tenses, and therefore demand substantive logic and structure. For Garcellano, the macro approach espouses critiques that acknowledge the recreation of historical moments in art, and one that acknowledges film as a recreation of a segment in reality without violating the very essence of what that particular reality is or posits to be. For Garcellano, film criticisms that re-inject the formalist's argument of universal latent chaos as an element or aesthetic in an artwork are signposts that 1. The critic lacks understanding of the elements of art itself. 2. The critic assumes the filmmaker has consciously denied his own will to understand the logics of cinema, and that, 3. The critic has attributed such a phenomenon to the mysterious handiwork of the divine, the suprahuman. Garcellano's dialectical materialism re-echoes Marx's materialist conception of reality in the German ideology when he says reality is the creation of man's interaction with his fellow man, following his dispensation that a film cannot be interpreted from the purview of the metaphysical and that cinema centers on the drama of human existence on the axis of contradictions of men in a collective. Garcellano insists that there is a stern and rational logic that governs cinema, and the task of the critic is not to obscure such logic by bringing up modalities of ambivalence and the metaphysics of indetermination. For Garcellano, the critic's inferential frame of reference cannot escape the stonework of class structure, and that contemporary reality is built on an already established class relations. In a way, this is his own way of capturing the bourgeois tendency of film criticism to fetishize the indeterminate and the metaphysical overstepping the material dimension of cinema. Aside from pursuing a critique on the metaphysics of cinema, Edel Garcellano's dialectical materialism pursues a line of critique on the author function of cinema. In the essay A Choice of Film Review, or Reviewing the Reviewers, while he engages with the critique of metaphysics, he also sees the importance of establishing the class-based analysis of the author function. Garcellano highlights this class-based perspective on the author function as integral to the ideological makeup of the film. He wrote, "The filmmaker," because by the very structure of the class, he represents, originates, from wittingly or unwittingly, echoes the ID fix of his class, can paradoxically transcend the very limitation of the class construct on the basis of the collectivity of filmmaking. He is still responsible for the final articulation of these diverse ideas and approaches, and is singularly made responsible for the summing up. Garcellano is quite critical when there is an attempt for creators of works of art to overstep each of one's own class origins. For him, the class origins of the author establish the conduct of most of film practice. It is important for Garcellano that film critics must establish the class bias of film creators as well as critics themselves in crafting their own expressions and their own work. Garcellano's critique of the author function is rooted in the appeal to dialectically apprehend the notion of free choice, overtaken by the neoliberal logic of capitalism. Garcellano re-emphasizes that choice is no more than an active and contextual manifestation of one's own critical intelligence, which intelligence defines the locus of a filmmaker's role specifically in the industry and generally in society. For Garcellano, one's choice is overdetermined by the historical process as well as one's own class bias. In his essay on Novecento, Warnings to Would-Be Bernardo Bertolucci's, Garcellano points out that filmmakers' ideological perspective must be studied, or more importantly, integrated into the critique of his cinema, primarily because this will constitute the qualification of his filmic progression, significance, and technical expertise. The rationale behind Garcellano's critique of the bourgeois author function, one that tries to remove class bias, is rooted in the Maoist insistence on social practice. In other words, Garcellano conceives filmmaking as a totality of social relations involved in the making of cinema. Garcellano's dialectical materialism outlines a line of critique that ensues from the desire to change the socio-economic condition of semi-feudal, semi-colonial Philippine society. However, as one shall observe, Garcellano paints a picture of a mode of critical practice that lacks the rigors of, let us say, Marx's analyses of the capitalist mode of production. This is because of Garcellano's tendency to deploy dialectical materialism implicitly and at times recommendatory, but always affirmative of its revolutionary character. What is deliberate, especially in his essay The Filipino as Critic in a Time of War, is Garcellano's affirmation of the principal contradiction in every critical and metacritical practice of criticism. The principal contradiction for Mao is one that determines all other contradictions in a society. For Garcellano, the principal contradiction is our society is under siege by U.S. imperialism. The historical overdetermination of the imperialist aggression of the U.S. in the construction of all forms of text, whether filmic or literary, positions the film critic not as an arbiter of taste, but the one that partakes in the urgency of partisan deployment, and therefore already enlisted as active combatants in a field where forces of resistance and imperialism are locked in a fatal embrace. It is this recognition of the principal contradiction that empowers the film critic to use the practice of film criticism to change the social practice of filmmaking. Aside from affirming the principal contradiction, it is also important for Filipino film critics to launch a critique of any form of metaphysical ambivalence that obscures the social practice of cinema, bearing in mind the sensuous and experiential realm of cinematic phenomenon prone to fetishistic gaze because of its capitalist mode of production. Militancy also involves vigilance to all forms of ideological constructs and equally to the class bias of the creator of the artwork. Thus, Garcellano urges Filipino critics to also criticize the function of the author, both filmmakers in question and of himself as a critic. Garcellano reminds Filipino critics that 1. Each has their own ideological filiations and modes, 2. Each has their own blind spots, and 3. One's creation, film or critique, cannot transcend history or society. What we can learn from Garcellano is a militant form of film criticism that advances partisan politics and one that places the principal contradiction of class struggle under U.S. imperialism at the center of the practice of writing. It is through this maneuver that film criticism can partake in changing the world. No need to locate the film critic, which Liwag has hopelessly tried in his essay titled, "Is There Still Space for the Filipino Film Critic?" For the militant Filipino film critic is always already engaged in the protracted people's war against imperialist aggression. Thank you.